Last time I was juxtaposing these two paintings, suggesting that they sort of provide a formally analogous aesthetic experience for the viewer, although their thematic content, seems totally opposed to one another, totally the opposite of one another. This is, all beauty and love, and this is bareness, and and they're both like explicitly, thematized. But I suggested that this, in a way, it's sort of like this painting, but it, where, as I talked about it, sort of the topic is looking, the act of looking, as a kind of, it's up to you to fill the space in a way. We're looking at this guy looking, and sort of our act of looking is what the painting's about in a way. And this, I think, is just leaves out the character, leaves out the human figure, and just lets us look at something even more wasted without even that minimal human interest, and feel like it's analogous to the ending scenes of so many works that we've been looking at. These works are all asking in one way or another the viewer whether we can sort of rehumanize this waste, like have some sort of sympathetic, imaginative, empathetic comprehension that teaches us about the time and death, and also community, shared visions of beauty. So I think it's sort of a indication of Keats's transitional status. I was sort of suggesting. I looked forward toward a more like consumer market for art, moving from the sort of branching highbrow poetry out of the kind of feudal market. And even though Keats was such a failure in his time, he was quite popular in the Victorian period. I think we can learn a lot about Keats's poetry from how it influenced artists that came after him, like the Pre-Raphaelite painters. So in these images we see illustrations of La Belle Dame sans Merci. The Pre-Raphaelites have sort of a dual objection to the tradition of painting the mainstream tradition of painting that followed from Raphael. On the one hand, overly individuated. I mean, I think one thing to say off the start is just Christian versus kind of pagan and mythological subject matter, but also I think principally the individuated characters, that you have a sense of looking at distinct individuals, but whereas these are more schematic. But then I think the main objection is that this individuation is just boring painting. These figures are individuated just by making them more boring to look at. I don't know. Washed out, empty space. And I think that's what these Pre-Raphaelite painters on the right were. They're interested in a kind of full ornamentation, full design value painting. I've been talking a bit about abstraction, both in painting and poetry, sort of empty abstract forms that end darkness, or what Wordsworth called forms that do not live like living men. Sort of these sublime forms that become vehicles for reflecting on death, the environment, the scary and uncontrollable aspects of human life, grief, sexuality. I think this progression is interesting to think about, because in terms of abstraction, what the Pre-Raphaelites objected to is sort of this empty space. But in Friedrich, we see a romantic painter just pouring on that empty space, even to the point of eliminating the human figure. And I think that's, what we see in these collapsing narratives that we've been discussing, kind of recognition of an essential hollowness or something, and violence to a certain narrative of human history. And so I think that's what's getting depicted here. But what we talked about as well was the role of personification in kind of creating new, I think what Keats would call negatively capable readership of active readers that are reflecting. We're being invited to reflect critically on social issues like patriarchy and industrialism, even globalism. But in these cases of communities of imagination, these active readers, the lack of individualistic detail that we see in these Pre-Raphaelite painters, how they attach, I think, to Keats's poetry, is that they give us sort of the schematic form of fantasies, not the individuated form. So in a way, I feel like they build on the image of collapse we see at the end of Frankenstein, and like darkness, just and like Keats's idea of negative capability, these paintings just invite us into a dream world, an emphatically, world of mysteries, uncertainties, and doubt. But that's the realm of the emotions. Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci is about the femme fatale, the dangerous woman, which is a very familiar and conventional figure trope going back to Eve in the Bible. But it assumes really unique new characteristics in the modern period as a confrontation with female sexuality, like just the prospect of female agency and pleasure and power outside of wedlock, beyond motherhood. Whereas Eve is a temptress, a snake that tempts you into things you shouldn't do. The femme fatale is a full-on enchantress and an object of obsessive and often self-destructive love. We've talked a lot and read a lot of stories about wrecks and ruins and waste. This is another example of a self-destructive male perspective, like Frankenstein. So the end of Frankenstein is total bleak, nihilistic, and the female perspective is just implicit, unspoken readers, and dead bodies, basically. In Byron's Darkness, we get the pronoun she. It's like kind of a proto-eroticizing. I mean, if nothing else, it's a poeticizing of the darkness with the metaphor of she. But here we get a positive, eroticizing of sort of the prospect of death. But it's the same desire for possession that ends up hollowing out the man. And reducing him to this literal repetition, like we're talking about cyclical, compulsive revenge. The speaker literally just becomes like like somebody's ventriloquizing him. There's something, again, as fantastical as this is, there's something psychologically kind of harrowing about it, if you ask me. There's a kind of realism to the fantasy that I find haunting. And just like having words ringing in your head that you just sort of mechanically repeat. So that's what the knight does at the end of this poem. He mechanically repeats the words that are spoken to him by this disembodied narrator. So I thought it's interesting to compare this to Ozymandias because um, it also has this kind of train of speakers. Or that's the question I want to ask you. Like, are do we? It's more questionable here, I think, who has a voice. Shelley kind of spells it out for us by saying, the statue speaks how the sculptor read. But what qualifies? I think it's questionable. Um, the status of voice in these different cases. I mean, the voice is questionable from the beginning. It's this weird disembodied voice, sort of like the piper in a cloud speaking to Blake. This disembodied voice speaking to the night, just kind of comes out of nowhere. I just find that a little like uncanny and kind of creepy. Because it really puts us in the knight's head. We just hear this question coming out of nowhere, and that's really the point about the knight, is that he's totally lost, totally disoriented. I think the tension in La Belle Dame sans Merci and Ozymandias, the operative tension is more or less the same. The tension between sort of voice of patriarchal power and voice of creative passion. But it's more schematically laid out in Ozymandias, I think, this kind of clear-cut division of labor, and this, clear symbol of the sort of invincible reality of time and death, mortality. These voices are all so much more ambiguous here, and this rather than this clear sort of symbol of mortality, we here it's it's similarly, like I mentioned, harrowing and a kind of existential void or something. This ambiguity, whether it's the narrator interrogating voice or the knight's voice, this question mark here. But we're kind of a lot more identified with, as readers, we're a lot more identified with the knight's kind of psychotic delusion, and we don't have as much quite the maybe objective distance. This is not as La Belle Dame sans Merci is not as kind of symbolically legible. For all the ambiguity of La Belle Dame sans Merci, there's no denying that it tells a narrative of consumption or conquest or scapegoating the woman, and that's true of the femme fatale, the function of the femme fatale figure generally. She's turned either into an object of erotic conquest, ensure in language strange, she said, I love thee true. It's like a claim to conquest. Or she's scapegoated as the ruin of the knight and the series of pale kings and warriors, or both. That's the I think the point of the femme fatale, object of dangerous desire. So again, in this way, La Belle Dame sans Merci is analogous to Frankenstein, so far as it's told from within the kind of psychotically unreliable perspective of male resentment. This turning now to Ode to Psyche, we see sort of a different and I think more typical and dominant approach to desire and the otherness of female desire, and sort of the infinite strangeness of desire per se. Keats manages to approach it in a positive way rather than rehearsing destructive attempts to possess or evade or blame the strangeness of desire. Keats manages to celebrate it, and I think in a way that's really special. And this, the form of the ode, singing songs of praise to the gods, is his typical method, although not exclusive. We'll also be looking at the romance, The Eve of St. Agnes. But this ode form, directed at the sublime, sort of infinite elusiveness of desire, becomes a vehicle for a kind of a queer poetics of failure, in a way, sort of celebration of failure, the infinite impossibility of capturing desire. And so, although I feel his the objects of Keats's odes, even the Grecian urn and autumn, have a kind of gender dynamic to them, that they tend to be kind of gendered female, as outsiders or orphans to the dominant patriarchal narrative conventions and history. I think ultimately, Keats's poetry moves beyond a kind of binary gender definition, and speaks and offers a powerful early example, I think, of queer poetics. As I suggest here, Psyche is the consummate Keatsian hero because she is the consummate orphan. Being orphaned, the Grecian urn, these figures of being abandoned by history, is the central defining trope for Keats, and it's a figure upon which new, I think, kinds of intimate, new kinds of family can be created, woven, new forms of home. There's even sort of ultimately, I think Keats, what he calls his chameleon poet, the chameleon poetry, is a self-transfiguring, self-engineering in the mode of Frankenstein. What's getting engineered in Keats is not a kind of, psychotic control that Frankenstein pursues, but as he puts it in Psyche, love and pleasure, and a self-determining desire that doesn't sort of evade its own elusiveness or try to replace the experience of desire, the temporal embodied reality of desire, with a claim to possess or a claim to know, but celebrates desire and its physical and emotional incompleteness, and that's what we see in this figure of the goddess orphan, I think. So I want to say a few things about what orphanage means for Keats. Um, uh, so Keats lived a very short, very hard life. His father was killed by a horse when he was 14. He lost his mother to tuberculosis. Um, he saw unimaginable horrors as a medical student of surgery. Learning to be a surgical assistant before there was anesthetics. It's kind of inconceivable. He lost his brother as well as his mother to tuberculosis, and ended up dying of it himself. Keats had a very passionate but frustrated, tortured passion for Fanny Brawne, um, sort of unrealized desire for her. Um, frustrated also by his illness, and it's depicted in the movie Bright Star. It's a really awesome movie. I'd really recommend it. And this is all, of course, in addition to the poor reception his poetry, received in his lifetime. Um, Although he did have encouragement from Percy Shelley, and some other important poets and literary people of the time. He was not acknowledged by the mainstream, and quite ridiculed, in fact. Um, so, who is Psyche, and how does the Psyche figure speak to Keats's experience of orphanage and abandonment, class alienation, sexual alienation, in this prototypical way that I think, as I mentioned, this poem, Ode to Psyche, sets a kind of model for how Keats's poetry in general works. It's a kind of ritual performance, turning frustration into an elaborate ritual. So Psyche, from the myth of Cupid and Psyche, is a mortal human who's the most beautiful, so beautiful that she made Aphrodite jealous, who sends her son Cupid to punish her, but Cupid falls in love with her instead, and makes love to her every night, until her curiosity gets the best of her, like it does all of us, and she can't help but try to sneak a peek at who he is, what he looks like. This is the scene of her tragic desire to see, to know. Another example of kind of the hubris of sight, wanting to capture desire in a vision, in knowledge, fix it in something we can possess in our minds. So I think Psyche. So Psyche is the word, from which psychology derives. It's the name of the soul, the mind, and it represents to Keats also, sort of the supreme pleasure, supreme bliss, um, being made to by the God of love, endlessly, but also this human fallibility, this need to know, this curiosity. Um, and so this liminal space of kind of familiarity with the utmost pleasure and love, but also having that slip through your fingers. And Psyche, likewise, is a liminal figure in history. Keats emphasizes she's the latest born, loveliest vision far of all Olympus's fated hierarchy. She's the last among the classical gods, the ancient gods, the pagan gods, and kind of precedes the advent of Christianity. So she's in this liminal space. She a figure of kind of utmost human predicament and lacking sort of orthodox following and institution that attached to the other classical gods and to Christianity. So he's worshiping as much as anything in an ode like this and his other odes. Keats is worshiping precisely Psyche's elusiveness, celebrating it, and elaborate, the most elaborate form possible, turning himself into an artwork in worship of her elusiveness. So just like in La Belle Dame sans Merci, we have really prominent repetition in Ode to Psyche. This refrain of listing all of the sort of institutional trappings that Psyche lacks. She has no apparatus of worship. Keats repeats it in an affirmative mode. So whereas the repetition in La Belle Dame sans Merci is acts out sort of the hollowness of the night, as if he was being ventriloquized, mechanical, kind of mindless repetition. This repetition is powerfully self-affirming. I'm creating my own religion. I'm making a religion of you, and my body is getting turned into your temple, a temple to your worship. And so I think this, in a way, it's draining the individual of selfhood. So giving up a kind of any kind of claim, proprietary individual claim to desire, to owning, possessing the object of desire. But on the other hand, like in these Pre-Raphaelite paintings, I think we get a thorough design of the fantasy, a fantasized desire. Desire is situated in this negatively capable domain of fantasy rather than reality. Um, so, so the elaboration of the love in poetic, sheer ornamentation, much like these paintings, becomes a kind of end in itself, rather than telling a narrative of conquest. This sort of performance of desire, the elaboration, the embellishment, um, the performance becomes an end in itself. Um, and uh, so likewise, he describes himself as turning into a kind of architecture, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at these. Um, uh, the experience of desire dissolves. It's not no longer an individuated thing, but a kind of pattern of fantasy, a little rather generic and not proprietary. Um, Yes, I will be thy priest and build a fane in some untrodden region of my mind, where branched thoughts, new grown with pleasant pain, instead of pine shall murmur in the wind. Far, far around shall those dark clustered trees fledge the wild ridged mountains, steep by steep. And there by zephyrs, streams, and birds and bees, the moss-lain dryad shall be lulled to sleep. And in the midst of this wide quietness, a rosy sanctuary will I dress, with the wreathed trellis of a working brain, with buds and bells and stars without a name, with all the gardener fancy e'er could feign, who breeding flowers will never breed the same. And there shall be for thee all soft delight that shadowy thought can win, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in.